The East Room of the White House was abuzz with excitement. It was the annual Future of America event, an initiative launched under President Donald Trump's second term in office. Each year, children from across the nation were invited to tour the White House, meet with national leaders, and learn firsthand about the government, leadership, and American values. This year's event was especially grand. Dozens of kids were selected through essays and community service nominations. With cameras capturing every angle, patriotic decorations lining the room, and Trump himself ready to speak, the atmosphere felt more like a State of the Union than a children's gathering. Among the children was Sophie Mayfield, a 9-year-old from rural Kentucky. With wide, hazel eyes and 2 long braids draped over her shoulders, Sophie looked more like someone plucked from a Norman Rockwell painting than a participant in a political event. She wore a simple white dress and carried with her a small notepad she'd been clutching tightly all day. Sophie hadn't said much during the tours or workshops until the president walked in. Trump entered the room to thunderous applause. The children stood, most in awe, some waving miniature flags. Parents and staff looked on as the president, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit and bright red tie, gave his signature thumbs up and began his remarks. He spoke about hope, about the strength of America, about freedom, hard work, and the power of dreams. And then, after delivering his address, he did something unexpected. He opened the floor for questions one by one. Children asked typical questions. What's your favorite food, Mr. President? Answer, McDonald's cheeseburgers. Do you ever get tired of being famous? Trump chuckled, only when the media's lying again. And, what do you do for fun? Golf, of course. Then, a small hand shot up from the third row. It was Sophie. Trump noticed her immediately. Something about her presence. Maybe the quiet calm, maybe the way she held her notebook like it was sacred, drew his attention. Yes, the young lady in the white dress, he said, pointing. What's your name, sweetheart? Sophie. Sophie Mayfield, she answered, her voice tiny but clear. Well, Sophie, Trump said, leaning on the podium. What's your question? She hesitated, then opened her notepad. Her small hands trembled slightly as she looked up. I wanted to ask you something different than the others. Trump smiled. Go for it. Sophie took a deep breath. Do you believe in God? And what do you think God thinks about America right now? The room went silent. Cameras stopped clicking. Aides looked around, unsure how the president would react. Even Trump blinked for a moment, caught off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, but because of how genuine and raw the question was. This wasn't a political zinger. It wasn't bait. It was a child's earnest inquiry about faith and country. And it cut through the noise like a blade. Trump straightened, then stepped down from behind the podium. He walked toward Sophie, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. When he got close, he kneeled just slightly, enough to be at her eye level. Sophie, he said gently, that's probably the most important question anyone's asked me all year. The young girl's eyes glistened. You see, he continued, I do believe in God, more than ever. He paused, placing a hand over his heart. And I believe God is watching this country closely right now. Not because we're perfect, but because we're trying. Because even in the middle of all the chaos, the division, and the shouting, there are people, like you, asking big, brave, honest questions. The room was quiet, the only sound being Sophie's soft sniffle. God isn't about politics, Trump continued. He's about truth, about courage, about love. And if there's one thing I believe with my whole heart, it's that America is still in his hands. Because we still have kids like you. Sophie wiped a tear. And then, Trump did something nobody expected, that he asked her if he could hug her. She nodded, that he wrapped his arms around her gently. And in that moment, the partisan walls that usually surrounded him seemed to dissolve. There was no campaign, no media, no debate. Just a president and a little girl, bonded by a question that echoed into the soul of a nation. The clip of Sophie's question and Trump's emotional response went viral before the event even ended. The moment hit every news outlet, flooded social media, and found its way into millions of living rooms across the country by nightfall. Even networks typically critical of Trump had to admit it was powerful. But while the media debated whether the moment was political theater or genuine emotion, one thing was certain: America had watched something rare. Raw humanity. Inside the White House, the mood had shifted too. Staffers who usually moved at lightning speed had paused for reflection. Secret Service agents, many of whom had seen everything from riots to foreign threats, spoke quietly about how that little girl brought something different today. Later that afternoon, Sophie and her parents were invited to meet privately with the president in the Oval Office. The room, known for its historical gravitas, felt unusually calm when Sophie stepped in. She held her notepad still, though now it had a small tear at the corner where she'd clutched it too hard. "Sophie," Trump said warmly, standing from behind the resolute desk. "You rocked the world today, you know that?" Sophie blushed, but then looked up. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to know what you thought. And you had every right to ask," he replied, motioning for her to sit with him on the couches. "You asked something that adults don't have the courage to ask anymore. That's something special." Her father, Mark Mayfield, a welder from Ashland, Kentucky, sat down next to her. Her mother, Rebecca, a Sunday school teacher, smiled but remained quiet, overwhelmed by the whole experience. "I want to tell you a story, Sophie," Trump began, settling back into the couch. "When I was younger, I didn't always talk much about God. I was raised Presbyterian, went to church, but as I got older, life got busy. Business, politics, the spotlight. And sometimes when you're in that world, you forget to pause. You forget to listen." Sophie nodded, eyes wide. "But over the years, especially as president, I've had moments where everything else fades away, and I hear him again. Not always in words. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a weight on the heart, a reminder." "What kind of reminder?" Sophie asked softly. "That no matter how powerful you think you are, you're still just a man. And God doesn't care how rich you are or how many votes you get. He cares about what's in your heart." The silence that followed was comforting. There was no rush, no need to fill the air with spin or sound bites. Rebecca finally spoke. "Mr. President, we were raised to believe that America was a nation under God. But lately, it's felt like people are forgetting that." Trump nodded solemnly. "They are. But I haven't. And neither have millions of others. We've just been afraid to say it. You know what your daughter did today?" He looked back at Sophie. "She reminded us all." Sophie glanced down at her notepad. "I wrote something before coming here. I wasn't sure if I'd show anyone." Trump leaned forward. "I'd love to hear it." She opened the page slowly. In the center was a crayon drawing of the American flag, and beneath it, written in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Dear God, please don't give up on us. We're still trying." The room went completely still. Trump looked at the words, blinked a few times, then whispered, "That might be the most powerful prayer I've ever heard." He reached over, touched the page gently, then looked at Sophie with a seriousness that even she could feel. "You know what, Sophie? I'm going to frame this, right here in the Oval Office, so I never forget why I'm here. Not for power, not for politics, but because kids like you still believe in this country." Tears formed in Sophie's eyes again, but this time they were different. They weren't from confusion or fear. They were from being seen, heard, understood. Mark cleared his throat, visibly moved. "We never thought this would happen. We're just regular folks from Kentucky." Trump smiled. "That's exactly why it matters. This country belongs to you." As the meeting ended, Sophie left her drawing with the president. Secret Service agents escorted them out gently, offering kind words and smiles as they walked back through the halls of American history. Behind them, Donald Trump stood silently in the Oval Office, still holding the note, still reading the child's prayer. The media frenzy outside didn't matter. The critics and analysts could wait. In that moment, the President of the United States was just a man, staring at a crayon plea from a little girl who reminded the world that faith still had a voice in America. The days following Sophie's question felt like a wave crashing over the nation. The image of President Trump holding Sophie's handwritten note, "Dear God, please don't give up on us. We're still trying," appeared on front pages, talk shows, and podcasts. Political commentators were split, as usual. Some called it a PR masterstroke, while others insisted it was a genuine American moment that transcended party lines. But beyond the media spin, something else happened. Something real. Churches across the country began reading Sophie's words aloud during Sunday services. Teachers printed it and taped it to classroom bulletin boards. Veterans, teachers, police officers, and even atheists commented online that somehow, that one sentence had moved them. It wasn't the president's speech or a fancy slogan. It was a simple, desperate plea from a child asking God to hold on to a struggling country. And Trump? He wasn't finished yet. The following week, President Trump opened a press briefing. Not with policy, not with attacks on political rivals, but with Sophie's note, now encased in glass, sitting behind him. "I want America to look at this," he said, tapping the frame gently. This was written by a little girl named Sophie, and in these few words, she captured what so many of us feel right now. That we're hurting, that we're lost sometimes, but that we're still trying. And that matters. Reporters were stunned. Cameras zoomed in as he read the note out loud again, his voice firmer than before. "We're still trying," he continued. "No matter how broken we seem, no matter how far we've fallen into division, I still believe, just like Sophie, that God hasn't given up on us. And because of that, we can't give up on each other." That day, something shifted in Washington. A group of bipartisan lawmakers, moved by the story, formed an initiative called the Sophie Project, aimed at promoting faith, civic unity, and moral education in schools. It wasn't political. It wasn't performative. It was human. For the first time in years, politicians from both sides stood side by side and spoke from the same page. The one Sophie wrote. Back in Kentucky, Sophie's small town of Ashland became something of a national symbol. The local church held a candlelight vigil, where neighbors and strangers alike gathered to pray, not just for Sophie, but for the country. Reporters traveled there, hoping to get interviews or a reaction. But what they found instead was quiet dignity. Rebecca Mayfield, Sophie's mother, gave a short statement to a local news crew. She wasn't trying to be famous. She was just trying to ask something she's been wondering about for a while. She prays every night. She sees the world and she asks us, "Is God still proud of us?" And when we don't know the answer, we tell her, "Ask him." So she did. Sophie's father, Mark, added, "We've always taught our kids to speak from the heart, even if their voice shakes, even if it's the President of the United States. Truth is truth, and sometimes it comes from the smallest among us." The school Sophie attended began receiving letters from all 50 states. Some were from pastors, others from soldiers overseas, and some from inmates who had seen the clip on prison television. One letter read, "I haven't prayed in 20 years, but that little girl reminded me what hope feels like. I got down on my knees that night, not because I had to, but because I wanted to." In Washington, President Trump invited Sophie's class to return for a special event, a national day of prayer and unity. The ceremony was simple. No fireworks, no red carpets, just Americans standing together, heads bowed. When Sophie took the stage to stand beside the president, the applause wasn't political. It was personal. People weren't clapping for her because she was famous. They were clapping because she was brave. Trump gave her a new version of her note, this time etched in bronze, and in front of a crowd filled with veterans, teachers, parents, and students, he said, "Sophie reminded us that God doesn't listen to how loud you speak. He listens to how honest you are. And in these times, we could all use a little more of that." Weeks passed, but Sophie's question still lingered in the airwaves of American consciousness. It had become more than a viral moment. It was now part of the cultural conversation. At family dinners, Sunday services, and even school assemblies, people were asking each other again, "Do you believe in God? What do you think he thinks of us right now?" And through it all, Sophie remained herself, humble, quiet, curious. Fame hadn't changed her. She still fed the chickens every morning, helped her mom in the kitchen, and did her homework just like before. But something inside her had shifted. She'd become more thoughtful. more prayerful, and she started writing in her notepad daily. Not just questions, but letters. Letters to God. She never showed them to anyone, but her parents noticed her whispering at her window sometimes at night. Notebook open on the sill. One night, her mother gently asked, "Sophie, what are you writing, sweetheart?" Sophie looked up with those same big hazel eyes. "I'm writing back." Rebecca was puzzled. "Back to who?" "To President Trump," she said. "But also to God. I want him to know I heard him." Rebecca felt chills. Sophie's letter that night read, "Dear God, thank you for listening to my question. I know you were there in that room. I felt you in my heart. And when President Trump hugged me, I felt like you were hugging me too. I know America is loud right now. I know people are scared and sad and fighting a lot. But I believe you still see the good. I see it too. I in my daddy's hands when he works hard. In the way my teacher says good morning every day. In my baby brother's laugh. I think maybe you haven't given up on us because you see what I see. I'm going to keep praying. I'm going to keep asking you questions. And I promise, I'll keep trying. Love, Sophie. What Sophie didn't know was that her parents had started compiling her letters. Not to publish or promote, but just to preserve. They felt they were witnessing something holy unfold. Something bigger than their family. Something the country needed to remember. One day, a letter came in the mail addressed to Sophie. It bore the seal of the White House. Inside was a typed letter, personally signed by President Trump. "Dear Sophie, your voice echoes louder than you know. Your faith reminds me of why this job matters, and what America still stands for. You asked the right question. And in doing so, you gave millions of people permission to ask it. I keep your drawing on my desk. Every morning I see your words, and I remember what this fight is really about. Not politics, not power, but people. I want you to know that your prayer made it into hearts all over this country. And maybe even into heaven. Don't stop writing. Don't stop believing. America needs more Sophies. With great pride, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States." When Sophie read it, she cried. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears of understanding, the kind a child sheds when the world becomes a little clearer. That Sunday, she read the letter in church. The congregation wept, not because it was from the president, but because of what it said. They realized that in all the noise of the world, the whisper of a child had cut through, and it had reached not only the president, but perhaps God himself. Back at the White House, Trump kept the note on the corner of his desk, right next to a small American flag pin and a worn copy of the Constitution. Visitors often asked what it was. "That," he'd say, tapping the glass frame, "that's America's conscience, written in crayon." And then, on a chilly Monday morning in October, something extraordinary happened. A call came from the Capitol. Congress had voted unanimously, yes, unanimously, to establish an annual observance on the first Sunday of November, National Day of Faith and Reflection. It wasn't a religious holiday. It wasn't about any one belief system. It was simply a day for Americans to pause, breathe, and remember the values that hold them together: faith, truth, courage, and the childlike wonder that Sophie had reawakened. In the legislation's official language, there was a quote. One sentence. "Dear God, please don't give up on us. We're still trying." And just below it, Sophie Mayfield, age 9. As autumn deepened and leaves painted the streets in shades of red and gold, the small town of Ashland, Kentucky found itself preparing for something unprecedented. News vans lined the streets. Flags were raised higher. The community center had transformed into a stage for history. It was the first National Day of Faith and Reflection, and Sophie Mayfield, the 9-year-old girl whose question had stirred the soul of a nation, was invited to speak once more. Not just before her class, not just to her town, but to the country. President Trump was there in person, flanked by veterans, religious leaders, teachers, and members of Congress from both parties. For one rare and solemn day, there were no political attacks, no campaign speeches, no spin, just silence and anticipation. Sophie stepped onto the podium wearing a simple white dress, her notepad in hand. She looked out over the sea of people, thousands gathered in person, millions more watching live. She cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "When I first asked my question, I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know it would be on TV or that people would care. I just wanted to know if our president still believed in God, and if he thought God still believed in us. That question came from my heart, because sometimes, when I watch the news or hear people arguing, it feels like we forgot something. Like we forgot that we're supposed to care about each other. She paused, taking a breath. The breeze lifted her hair slightly. But then I saw something I didn't expect. I saw people cry. I saw people pray. I saw people listening to each other again. I'm not special. I'm just a girl who asked something honest. And I think maybe that's what we need more of. Honest questions, honest hearts. She looked to her right, locking eyes with President Trump, who gave her a quiet nod of encouragement. The president told me that no matter how powerful you are, God still sees your heart. And I believe that. I believe he sees all of us. Not just what we do, but what we hope for and what we're afraid of. She held up her notepad, now a bit more worn, the pages slightly bent. I still write letters to God, and I think he still listens, even when things are hard, especially then. A hush fell over the crowd. It was a kind of silence rarely felt. Heavy, sacred, like the pause after a final chord in a church hymn. Then Sophie said the words that would echo long after that day. If we want God to believe in us, maybe we need to believe in each other again. That line was replayed on every network. Printed on posters, bumper stickers, even stitched onto quilts by church ladies from Alabama to Oregon. After Sophie stepped down, President Trump returned to the microphone. He didn't give a speech. He just placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "This young lady didn't just move a nation. She reminded us of its soul. Thank you, Sophie. On behalf of America." The crowd erupted, not in political cheers, but in something more human, more spiritual. Applause for a child who had given her country its conscience back. 1 year passed. The National Day of Faith and Reflection was now an established part of American life. Schools organized assemblies, communities hosted interfaith breakfasts, and millions of Americans, regardless of politics or religion, took time to reflect, pray, and reconnect. Sophie returned to a quieter life, but she never stopped writing. Her collection of letters was published in a simple book called Dear God, I'm Still Listening. It wasn't a bestseller in the traditional sense, but it found its way into hospitals, prisons, churches, military bases, and elementary classrooms across the country. President Trump kept his promise too. The framed crayon prayer remained on his desk through the rest of his presidency. Even in moments of crisis or policy debate, he'd often tap the glass and mutter to his aides, "Let's not forget what really matters." Reporters eventually noticed something odd about the note. It had begun to fade just slightly, like the paper itself couldn't bear the weight of what it carried. But to Trump and to America, it never lost its power. Because the legacy of that moment wasn't about a child or a president. It was about a country rediscovering its soul through the simplest act. A little girl asking about God.